After the failed attempt of cursing the Israelites, Midian and Moab team up again, this time with a new strategy of sending their daughters off to mingle with the Israelite men when they visited the public markets or the local shuk. There the Israelites would be introduced by the daughters to local pagan culture that would ultimately lead to being sexually seduced into worshiping their deities. Bilam knew this would be the only way left to weaken Israel. Unfortunately, the plan was successful, and the combination of idolatry and sexual immorality naturally led to a plague that took the lives of thousands. So Moshe hears about what's going on and he calls for an emergency meeting. All the tribe leaders must be present at his tent. Attending this meeting is Zimri, a tribe leader, but he doesn't come alone. He comes with his Midianite lover. And they begin to have sex there and then in public in front of all the elders, where at that point the Talmud says he turns around and he looks at Moses and he says, "What are you going to do about it? Seriously, is this not familiar to you? We know you took a Midianite woman as your lover and wife, and we know that she has a very famous father, Yitro or Jethro, who is the pagan high priest of Midian. Moses, we know your family. So don't even begin to think of trying to rebuke or correct us." And at that point, Moses is silent. He's in shock. And in that moment of shock and silence, his grandnephew, meaning Aaron's grandson named Pinchas, he cannot contain himself. He is the archetype religious zealot. He draws a spear and he puts an end to Zimri and his Midianite lover and an end to the plague. But the people of Israel are in an uproar. Taking the law into his own hands is a big problem, and they're about to gang up on him when God intervenes and he says that Pinchas is under his protection and that he has a special covenant with Pinchas, ironically labeled the covenant of peace, Brit Shalom. Zimri is the Torah's classic anarchist, and even though he has a legitimate argument against Moses, saying, "Moses, you're telling us not to take Midianite women and not to be involved in this idolatrous pagan cults, look at who you are," right? Even though the argument is legitimate, most anarchists completely lose perspective on what is a normal way of approaching a situation. They might go destroying city property. They might start arson fires. They will attack people. They'll use force. They'll use violence. And somehow they really believe that they're going to reestablish some kind of ideal utopian state in society. They are the most foolish ones. The Torah is taking Zimri and saying, you want to end up like Zimri, dead, then you continue in your anarchist ways. You will never, ever prevail as an anarchist. You will self-destruct as Zimri did, even if you're an advocate for the right cause. Chaos and violence is never, ever a way to bring about your intention or whatever you feel is your ideal. Pinchas is an interesting one. And the way to understand the text, this is right after he slays the anarchist rebel, and God gives him a covenant of shalom, of peace, of wholeness. One way to understand it is the following. When someone who's hungry comes to God, God provides food. When somebody is ill, God provides healing. When someone is disturbed inside, their spirit is disturbed, God gives a covenant of peace. You ask anyone who served for their country, had to go to war, had to go overseas, and had to do what was necessary to defend themselves and their land and their country and their families. Nevertheless, they come home with this feeling of being disturbed, so it only makes sense that God gives them a covenant of peace, and finally a formal role in the priesthood. He wasn't formally a priest, even though he was a relative of Aaron. And now he has a life of a priest, a life of serenity, of serving God, and less of a public role as leader. Even though this is a covenant of peace, this is not to encourage other religious fundamentalists. And where we see this is in the word shalom. Here, let's take a closer look at the Hebrew word for peace. There's only one time in the entire Torah where a letter is allowed to be written as broken, and that is this letter Vav in the word peace or shalom, specifically talking about the covenant of peace made between God and Pinchas. And here's a little idea of what a normal Vav would look like besides the broken Vav. And this is very interesting, considering that according to Jewish law, no letter in a Torah scroll can be flawed or imperfect. If there's any kind of imperfection in one letter, if it's broken or chipped or disfigured in any way, it invalidates the entire Torah scroll. And so the question is why? Why does the word peace have to have a defective letter Vav? Well, the letter Vav in Hebrew means connection. And in God's name, Yud He Vav He, Vav is the connection to heaven. It's the connection to the upper worlds. And so as much as we try to do God's will here on earth, if it's done through violence or pain or harm or suffering or destruction, you might have a temporary establishment of peace and order here in this world, but it'll never be a legitimate connection. It'll never be a legitimate channel to connect heaven and earth. That means that anything that is done through destruction, it's not a lasting peace. It's a defective attempt at peace. So we even say that shalom is God's name. And so God's name can never be made complete here in this world as long as it's done through some means of suffering or violence. And this is a principle for all religious fundamentalists. I know you fundamentally love God, but you can't use ugly ways to produce beautiful results. One of the things we can learn about in this week's Parsha is the necessity for control over our lower nature, whether it be in the areas of lust, arrogance, passion, anger, and impulsivity. You see, we have a saying, the brighter the light, the darker the shadow. The Israelites were not sinners, but fully human. And the closer one is in proximity to God's light, the more the shadow side of ourselves will act out. Half the battle in conquering this self-defeating part of ourselves is the awareness that there is a problem. So I'm asking God in prayer to help lift and remove these defects in us. Please, God, remove arrogance and impulsivity. Give us the patience to have the right mind with the right approach and to make the higher choices in life. And being that this Parsha marks the end of a plague, we ask you, God, to lift any health challenges that we are facing, that we may experience full recovery. Heal us in the same way the Israelites were spared and healed from the plague they were facing. And finally, in our tradition, it is said that the broken Vav in the word shalom will one day be restored when the global tikkun is in motion. In fact, the whole number of the word shalom is 376, the same number as the phrase Zehu Mashiach, implying that the true shalom, the true peace, is something that is granted when we collectively own our part in the great next shift in consciousness. Until that great day, we ask God to continue to bless and protect us from others and at times from ourselves. Shabbat Shalom.